Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. In the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha, the first truth is the truth of dukkha. The second is the origin of dukkha. The third is the ending of dukkha. And the fourth is the path leading to the ending of dukkha. I'd like to focus this evening on the second noble truth and talk about what that actually means, the truth of origin. Dukkha is caused by Tanha, and this is usually translated as suffering is caused by desire. So right out of the gate, there's a problem with the translation of both words. The English words are, in the case of suffering, it's too narrow, and in the case of desire, it's too broad. So people who haven't looked too deeply into it and have only been superficially exposed to the English translation, they often get wrong ideas about Buddhism. People think that Buddhism is very pessimistic because of life is suffering, whereas it's not actually what it says. It says life is dukkha, and there's an important difference. At one point I was giving a talk someplace, and in the question and answers somebody asked, "How come you Buddhists, all you ever talk about is suffering?" And I said, "That's not fair. We also talk about pain, grief, misery, and despair." Then I give the more serious answer. Dukkha can be suffering, but it's broader than suffering because dukkha applies to all experience other than nibbana, other than the unconditioned. All experience is dukkha. And you know from your own experience that not all experience is suffering. There are pleasant moments in this life, and there's plenty of neutral moments that are neither pleasant nor painful. Just boring old neutral phenomenon. But these are all classified as dukkha. Dukkha points to an inherent fault or imperfection in all phenomena, that nothing is perfect or fully satisfying. And it's important to understand this is a characteristic of the objects themselves. It's not something we impose on the objects with our mind. All conditioned objects are imperfect, unsatisfying, even the most pleasant ones, even existence in the Dewa realms. There's still dukkha. Nothing can fully satisfy the mind, and nothing is completely whole and perfect. And this has to do with the nature of reality. That because phenomena take manifestation, they are always and initially somewhat broken. There's no perfect, complete, whole phenomena. Everything is in a state of flux and transformation and incomplete and provisional in some sense. But the form of dukkha as suffering, which is called in Pali dukkha dukkhata, or dukkha per se, you might say dukkha as dukkha. This is the kind that is obviously problematic. There's the existential kind of dukkha, that's birth, sickness, old age, and death, that all conditioned beings are subject to some degree or another. And there's also the dukkha of not getting what you want, and the dukkha of being attached to or associated with that which you do not want. These are forms of dukkha as well. So the second noble truth asks, what is the cause of dukkha? And the answer is tanha. And tanha is usually translated desire or craving, but that's actually not completely correct, because there are forms of what we would call desire that are useful or wholesome. There's a desire for liberation, a desire for knowledge, desire to help others. These are not unwholesome desires. They're not included in tanha. Pali has the word chanda. That's a more general form of the word for desire, that would include both the wholesome and unwholesome depending on the object. But tanha is specifically defined as of three kinds. So it's got a narrow definition. There are three kinds of tanha. There's kama tanha, which is the desire for sense pleasures. There's the bhava tanha, which is the desire for existence or being, the desire for being or becoming. And vibhava tanha, the desire to not be or not become. And these are the three that are the cause of suffering. For those of us who are in existence in a human form, kama tanha is the most obvious, it's the noisiest, demands the most attention, it causes the most immediate trouble. But the other two are more profound and deeper, and they underlie, and they lay at a deeper level of the psyche than kama tanha. Kama tanha, or desire for sense objects, refers to the impulse or drive to acquire and or experience pleasant sights, sounds, tastes, touch, and also mind objects. We're talking six senses in the Buddhist system. And also included would be the negative form of this, would be the desire to escape from unpleasant sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches, and mind objects. In the dependent origination, the Bhattichu Samappada, which is basically an elaboration in detail of the first and second noble truth, we can get a closer look at how this works, how this functions on the level of human psychology. Because we're endowed with six senses, we're beings that have these six windows by which we take in information from the world. We are constantly experiencing contact with objects, external objects, through the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And then there's immediately a feeling arises, a vedana. This is something that occurs automatically with every sense contact. Because of vijnana, there arises phassa. Because of phassa, there arises a vedana. Vedana is a feeling that we react in a emotive way to every sense object. as being pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. And this is a very basic rudimentary level of mental processing, and it's something unavoidable. It's given as a resultant. It's not something that's really under our control. If you see something beautiful that's a pleasant sense object, you feel sukha vedana, happy feeling. See something ugly or frightening, then you feel dukkha vedana, unhappy feeling. And this is a completely automatic resultant factor, not something that we control. It's something that we do automatically when we contact anything with the senses. So it's classed as a resultant. Vedana, feeling that arises automatically from sense contact. In the Paticcasamuppada, that's considered the last resultant factor, and you turn a corner there, and you're now entering a process that we do have some control over, that's volitional, that has at least a volitional element. Although if we don't exercise the volition, if we don't make an effort, we'll just follow automatically down the path of least resistance. But after a feeling arises, then this is where Tanha arises, because of Vedana Tanha. And this is particularly Kamha Tanha, sense desire, sense object desire. And the relationship between feeling and craving is very basic and it's very strong. There are all kinds of things that we might desire in the world. You could probably make a list of things you crave or desire, but if you examine any item on the list, why do I want this? Why do I desire this? And you trace it back far enough, ultimately you want it because you think it will give you happy feeling. It's what you really crave is happy feeling, sukha vedana. And to avoid dukkha vedana, unhappy feeling. And everything else, all the objects, are means to that end. So we fall into this craving, and this is said to be in the Paticcasamuppada, this link is said to be the key one for practice. And this is the value of doing Vedanusati, contemplation of feelings, to be mindful of your feelings when they arise. There's nothing spiritually either positive or negative about feelings. They're automatic, they're resultant. But then it's what you do with them. If you allow that to go into craving, or in a case of an unpleasant feeling, you go into resistance and negativity, then you're driving the next stage of the dependent origination. And you're creating the groundwork for suffering. This is why craving leads to suffering, is what comes next. From Tanha, there arises Upadana, which is usually translated clinging, and that's not bad in some ways, but a more literal translation is as fuel. It's a kind of metaphorical title. It's a fuel for further becoming. Upadana is different from craving. Tanha is different from Upadana, craving and clinging. Because craving is a very simple movement of the mind. It's not complicated. It's just the drive of the mind. I want this or I don't want that. But then with clinging, it starts to become more of elaboration of it. You could say it becomes a project. It's no longer just, I want that, but how am I going to get it? You start to move into a more complex mind state with clinging. There's a analogy that I think it's from Ajahn Chah. It's from the Thai forest tradition anyway, of clinging. In the past, and maybe still today, I don't know, but in the past, country people in Thailand would sometimes try to capture monkeys to train them. And the way they capture a monkey is you get a coconut and you drill two holes in it. You hollow it out, two holes, one small one and one a little bit bigger. The small one you pass a rope through with a knot and tie that to a tree. You put some kind of treat, like a piece of mango or something, inside the coconut, and the monkey will come along and he'll reach with his paw and get the mango, and he can get his hand in, but then when he's got his fist made holding the mango, he can't get it out. And the monkey won't open his hand and lose the mango. He struggles and struggles and cries and screams, so that alerts the people that that he's there, and he gets caught. And this is the craving, as you're putting your hand in for the mango, and then clinging as you got a hold of it. You're not letting it go, and you're trapped now. Yeah. And because of clinging, being, like I said, like a project, this is where the first germ of self-creation occurs. Because in craving, you just have a simple desire, but now it's more elaborate, and there's a structure, a mental structure to it. And if there is a desired object, there has to be someone to do the desiring. There's a possession and a possessor. So you create that duality at that moment. Me lacking that piece of mango, and there's that piece of mango. So there's the two poles, and a self is created, or beginning to be created. Then in the next stage is bhava, becoming. You come into being as a particular entity with particular qualities. Now I'm the monkey reaching in for the mango. I've taken on that identity as the grasping monkey. And this process of becoming then is all sort of on a momentary level, but then the following stages are the longer term karmic outflow of that, and that results in birth, sickness, old age, and death. You're coming into being because you desire objects. And you set that karmic groundwork for birth, and whenever there's birth, that's inevitably followed by sickness, old age, and death. So when a being like a human comes to the end of their lifespan, they die, unless they're an arahant, then when they die, at the moment of death, they're still craving and there's still karma outstanding. So the mind will have to complete that loop, and it'll arise again elsewhere. So the being is driven onwards ultimately by desire, by this craving for sense objects. But as I said at the outset, there's two other forms of tanha that are deeper and more fundamental, because it's possible to transcend sense desire altogether. As a Brahma being, for example, there's a whole class of cosmological beings that have no sense desire whatsoever. But they're still in samsara, they're still coming into being because they're still subject to the two deeper forms of tanha. And in this human form, it might be possible to attenuate the sense desires. And with an anagami, is the third stage of awakening, is someone who has completely eliminated sense desire, but they're still in existence, and they still have these two deeper forms of craving. And they underlie the psychology at a deeper level. So even if you've managed to subdue your sense desire to some degree, then you'll still have these two deeper forms. And these are the poles of desire to be and desire not to be. To be or not to be, that is the question. We're constantly driven by these polar desires, opposite desires. Desire to be, bhava tanha, is at its most fundamental. It's just a desire to exist, the impulse to exist. Like vibhava tanha, at its most fundamental, is desire not to exist, or desire for annihilation. But they take lesser forms, or more the way they play out in the life. Desire to be, bhava tanha, is often expressed as the desire to be more, to have more being, to be more important, more powerful, stronger, more popular. You get your face on the cover of the Rolling Stone. This is bhava tanha. The desire to aggrandize yourself. Right? Vibhava tanha, if someone is in an extreme vibhava tanha, then that's suicidal. But everyone who's not an arahant, experiences the lesser degrees of bhava tanha frequently. It's basically that desire to be less. And this really means to be less conscious. So oversleeping is a common one. Just want to drug yourself with sleep, or taking drugs, alcohol or drugs is at root is vibhava tanha. You want to dull down your consciousness, because consciousness can be felt or experienced as a burden. You want to just sort of tune out, veg out, right? This is a common desire that everybody experiences from time to time. And this is vibhava tanha. And if it's indulged in and carried, allowed to play out, that leads to depressive states of consciousness and just being dull and dead inside and miserable. And just like bhava tanha would lead to overexcitement and kind of manic states of consciousness. And these impulses, as I say, are more fundamental than sense desire, the underlying sense desire. But in our ordinary life, sense desire demands the most attention. It's the most obvious. It's the noisiest, but it's also the most superficial of the three. Even the Brahma gods experience bhava tanha, particularly bhava tanha, but also in one particular realm is the result of vibhava tanha, the realm of body only, beings that have no consciousness or perception. It's kind of interesting to me that there's a analog to these three forms of desire in the Christian gospel, the story of Jesus in the desert and his encounter with the devil. And the devil tempts him 3 times. And the first time the devil tempts him with bread. He says, Jesus was fasting for 40 days. So the devil said, I can turn these rocks into bread and you can eat your fill. So that's the sense desire for taste. And Jesus said, get thee behind me, Satan. As the Buddha would say to Mara, I know thee, Mara. Jesus said to Satan, get thee behind me, Satan. And then Satan tried to tempt him with power, bhava tanha. He said, bow down to me and I'll make you king of the world, and all the nations shall be in your control. And Jesus said, get thee behind me, Satan. And finally he used vibhava tanha. He said, throw yourself off the cliff. Just make an end of it. And Jesus said, get thee behind me, Satan. So there's the three forms of craving right there. There's also a kind of parallel in Freudian psychology. There's three drives in human psychology that Freud recognized. There's the libido, which is like sense desire, particularly sexual desire in Freud's system. Then there's the id and thanatos. Id is the primordial kind of self, is sort of the the being, desire to be, and thanatos is the death wish, desire not to be. So these drives have been recognized by by other schools, other thinkers, and they are, as the second noble truth. That's the definition of Tanha. Those three, when it's elaborated in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, that when the Buddha elaborates the four truths, he says there are these three forms of Tanha. And those are the drives that keep us in being. And as long as there is sense desire, then there's karmic potential to be reborn in the sense desire realm as an animal, human, or deva, etc. But even when that's transcended, there's still the impulse to be, which will result in birth in the Brahma realms if there's no sense desire left. So they're behind the mental impulse to come into being, and they're the cause of birth, of rebirth. So they are the cause of dukkha. And it's the first effort in practice should be to recognize these impulses in yourself when they arise, and to see them at their first arising at sense contact, and then at that moment you have the option to follow them or not. You can see by reflection that having desires is inevitably going to result in suffering, because you can never satisfy all your desires. So there's always going to be suffering and craving and wanting. Sometimes there's a reaction or a feeling in people that they don't like the sound of that. They don't want to get rid of their desires. And the Buddha told a story or a metaphor to say, why would you want to keep having these desires? He said, you've seen in the marketplace here, there's this old leper that sits begging in the marketplace, and his body is covered in weeping sores, and he keeps beside him a little brazier of hot coals, and every now and again he'll pick a hot coal out with the tongs and drive it into one of his weeping sores to cauterize it, and that gives him momentary relief from his pain. And he said that if that leper could be miraculously cured and made whole and clean and would walk away from the marketplace, do you think he'd ever be nostalgic and miss the hot coals? You think he'd ever regret that he doesn't have the hot coals anymore? And then he explained the metaphor. The weeping sores are like the sense organs. They're constantly causing distress, and you can temporarily relieve your misery by taking the hot coal as like the pleasant sense object that will just temporarily assuage the misery of the weeping sore. A less gruesome analogy, if that's not to your taste, you can think of a a young child. Like, remember when you were a little kid, you had some favorite toy, your toy truck or your dolly or whatever it was, that your teddy bear, and you couldn't imagine living without it. This was like the most wonderful thing, and if it was missing, you'd cry all day, you know. And now you're grown up, and you don't want that anymore. You're not even having the slightest interest in toy trucks or dollies. It's like, it's. But at one time, it was the most important thing in the world. Huh? And final point of clarification may be to make, or reiteration, to make it clear that there's nothing wrong with pleasant sensations or feelings. That's not the issue. That's a karmic result. You're getting good experience because of good karma. But it's your reaction to it, your desire for it, your craving that causes you suffering. And there's a kind of a consequence of this that may not be considered, that having craving and clinging in the mind actually spoils pleasant experience. That when something pleasant arises in the field of awareness, if you're craving for it, you're already corrupting the mind. You're not enjoying the present moment. Very often, how this takes the form of anticipating its loss was already present. You're thinking, well, this is not going to last. I'm going to lose this. And you may even start going to scheming of how you can keep it, instead of being in the present moment and enjoying the present moment. In Japan, they have this cherry blossom festival. There's like 2 or 3 days in the year when the cherry blossoms come out, and they're like really beautiful, and people come to see them. And to the Japanese mind, it was very influenced by Buddhism. The impermanence of the experience is part of the piquancy of it. It's like the poignancy of this beautiful moment. It just lasts a moment. But you get some Westerners who try and, like, they'll get a cherry blossom and put it in plastic, or try and preserve it. And the Japanese just shake their heads. Why? What's the point? So they're trying to craving for this experience to last, right? So this is a summary of craving as the cause of suffering, and the real meaning of those words Tanha and Dukkha, and the three forms of Tanha.